Hello once again and welcome to our next module. In this module, as you can tell, we're going to be looking specifically at the issue of eating meat and the ethics of how we produce and consume meat in the 20th or 21st century American food system. And some of the issues are going to be similar to what we talked about last time in regard to the eggs. But obviously the issues are a little different when we look specifically at meat because with egg production, at least as long as the chickens are producing eggs, the chickens are kept alive. And of course, there's debate about what kind of life they're living. But obviously, you're only getting eggs as long as the chicken is alive and relatively healthy. When we look at meat production, of course, the whole goal here is to raise the animals toward the point of ultimately slaughtering them for the meat. And this is obviously something that raises a lot of ethical issues for quite a few people. So what I want to do in this module is to walk through some of those questions and present a couple different perspectives on eating meat. And then we will end up with an open question to you all to think about what you believe in regards to the ethics of eating meat and whether we need to make any changes or what kind of changes and why should we make them. But to start off, we need a quick little snapshot of how meat is typically produced in this country. And obviously, if this is something that you're interested in, there's a lot of literature out there about modern meat production. But really, the kind of central model and the thing that receives the most attention, it's sometimes referred to as factory farming, but the more technical term for it is concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs or CAFOs. But these are basically the meat equivalent of the other industrial models that we've looked at in terms of crops and eggs. And so over the course of the 20th century, just like we saw in those other areas, an increasing concentration of production in smaller numbers of really big farms, increasing reliance on technology, increasing reliance on different chemical products. You see the same thing happening in the area of meat production. And basically, how it used to be back in the early days that Konka talks about in his book, where you would have at every farm a few pigs, a few milk cows where you would raise the calves for meat, and some chickens where you would also occasionally butcher them for meat as well. That model has basically disappeared, and the overwhelming majority of the meat that Americans consume today is produced through these concentrated animal feeding operations. So when we're talking about beef, you can go see these in western Kansas, the huge feedlots where the relatively young animals are brought after their initial few months on whatever farm they come from. They're brought to these feedlots, and there they are basically put together in huge numbers in a relatively concentrated space and fed a lot of grain, and also given a large number of hormones and other drugs, and brought up to market weight, where they are then butchered and sent off to stores and restaurants. With hogs, you see a similar thing where hogs are raised, again, in these huge buildings, much like chickens are raised. You can see a picture of it here on the page. And we already talked about chickens, although for meat chickens, they tend not to use the battery model as much. It tends to be just the large kind of warehouse-type barns full of chickens being raised for meat. But what these concentrated animal feeding operations allow is the same sort of efficiency and use of technology that we've seen in the other modern systems that we've looked at. So it allows a much more efficient use of labor. It allows you to purchase your supplies cheaper because you're doing it on a larger scale. And so all of the feeding is concentrated as well. And there's been a lot of development in terms of creating particular strains of animals that will put on weight very quickly and efficiently. There are also a lot of developments in terms of hormones that are given to some of the animals, and then also different types of drugs, particularly antibiotics, given to the animals in order to speed along their growth. And all of this has resulted in, as in the other areas, a real revolution in the production of meat. Really, at no other time in history has there been so much meat available for people to eat at such a relatively low price. And I'm sure you've all seen a large number of studies that talk about how much more meat we eat even than, say, our grandparents or their parents before us, not to mention further back in history. And obviously there's a lot of debate in terms of the impact this has on our health. And many, or most, I think, doctors and nutritionists would encourage most people to eat less meat, even if we're going to eat some, because this is really kind of unprecedented to have this amount of meat in our diet. But all of that is possible because of these operations where you produce large numbers of animals in a very small space with a lot of concentrated use of technology and capital. And so, this really has made possible the modern American lifestyle, where we have kind of the McDonald's hamburger as our kind of iconic food. But as you might well suspect, and as you've no doubt already read on the page, there are quite a few criticisms that have been raised about this particular aspect of the American food system. And just to go through some of the key issues that we won't delve into in real detail here in the time we have, there's a lot of criticism raised in regard to the pollution produced by these concentrated animal feeding operations. When you have that many chickens together, it produces a lot of manure. Even more so if you have a lot of hogs together or a lot of beef cattle, you're going to end up producing really immense amounts of manure. Now, again, back on the old traditional farm, if you had a couple hogs, a couple head of cattle, they would, browse around the pasture, and they would basically do their own job of spreading out the fertilizer, and it was actually a beneficial part of keeping the animals. When you have thousands and thousands of animals in one building, in one place, or even in one kind of feedlot, what was an advantage in the old system becomes a real problem, and how to deal with all of that manure. And just a simple fact of biology is that any one particular area of ground is not going to be able to accept and incorporate that much manure. And so what happens is it needs to be collected and then shipped off and spread over a much larger area of land, or it's going to just run off, so that when it rains, large quantities of this stuff is going to basically flow downstream. And so both of those things happen with these feedlots and such that we see in America today. There are different types of technology that are used to collect all of that manure and store it and then apply it to fields in the area. But a lot of times that doesn't work right. If there's flooding, you can have the escape of these lagoons of hog manure, which is really a pretty nasty prospect. And even when you spread out the manure from some of these large operations over a large number of surrounding fields, there still is a limited holding capacity there. So you still often end up with problems with a lot of runoff of this. And of course, as you might guess, having large quantities of manure runoff coming into the water system can raise real problems in terms of water quality for those downstream. So there's a lot of criticism aimed at these operations because of that, because of the water pollution. And then there's also air quality issues, that there's a large amount of gas, for lack of a better term, released by these animals and by those huge quantities of manure. If you've ever driven through western Kansas, particularly in the summer, you've experienced this. But for those who live in these communities, this becomes a real issue and can have a real impact on quality of life and even health. And so there are many people who are critical of these operations because of their impact on air quality, and then also because, as you might guess, the people who take jobs at these sorts of operations tend to be from the poorer segments of society, tend to be from the more marginalized parts of society, and there can be many cases where people have health effects from breathing in this air with all of these gases in them, and so that it can raise issues not just in terms of the effect on the environment, but also the effect on the people who work in these operations and who live nearby them. So there are real criticisms raised about that, and there are many communities that work to ban or to get rid of these kinds of operations in their community. There's also, of course, real questions raised about the health of the food produced from these sorts of facilities. And if we go back to that whole question of natural law and treating creatures as creatures and not as machines, there are a lot of ways that there are problems with that in these concentrated animal feeding operations, right? That you don't have pigs that are rooting through the ground and digging for scraps and doing all the things that pigs naturally do. They're kept in these large concrete floored buildings. In many cases, they're kept in very narrow stalls, sometimes where they can't even turn around, and basically fed really concentrated feed, the whole goal being to increase their body weight as quickly as possible. Right? And this is a very, most people would argue, or many people would argue, a very unnatural condition for this animal. And the same is true for beef cattle and for chickens being raised for meat as well. That there's not really any sort of a natural environment or an opportunity to engage in natural behaviors. They're basically confined in a particular space and just intensively fed until they reach slaughter weight. Along with that, there are issues in terms of how they are fed, particularly with cattle. Most people probably know cattle are, by design, ruminants. That is, they eat grass and they chew it, and then they partially digest it and chew it again when they chew their cud. And there's a very complicated digestive process that cattle have developed, and it's really based on eating grass. But in the feedlots, that is not a practical possibility with that many animals concentrated in a small space. And they put on weight much slower eating grass, and the meat is a different quality to it. So what's preferred is feeding them large quantities of grain. And the cattle can eat the grain, and they can eat it for a good while, and they will put on weight very quickly, but it's also not what their bodies are designed really to eat. And so eating lots and lots of grain instead of grass produces health problems. That and also standing around in huge amounts of manure from all the other cattle around them. This produces real health problems and makes them very susceptible to illnesses, so that they are also given large quantities of antibiotics, typically to keep those illnesses at bay long enough for the animals to reach slaughter weight. So there are questions about if these animals are kept in these unnatural conditions and given antibiotics to keep them alive in these conditions, what does that mean about the quality of the meat we're eating? Are there going to be residual amounts of these antibiotics? And then also, is it just going to be healthy meat? If these are sick, unhealthy animals that we are eating, that raises real questions about the healthfulness of the meat that's being produced in these operations. And so there are a lot of people who raise that as an objection here as well. And then, of course, there's also the whole aspect of how the animals are then ultimately killed and butchered, which raises a whole other set of questions. And typically, the animals produced in these environments are sent to large slaughterhouses where there's very much an assembly line approach where everything is largely automated, although there are still workers, in many cases illegal immigrants, who are the only people who will take the jobs. and there are real questions there, but we'll cover some of that in a future module when we look at workers in the agricultural systems. But there are all these questions raised about the concentrated animal feeding operations. But there's also then this other basic question about the ethics of eating animals at all and killing animals to eat them at all. And so I want to really kind of focus on that particular question as we look at the next couple of pages. So we've just gone through a big discussion of these modern meat production systems, these concentrated animal feed operations, or factory farms, if you will. And basically, the situation that everybody acknowledges is that there are a lot of problems with this way of producing meat. That it does have, raises problems of pollution, raises questions about the health effects on people, and it's not an ideal working environment, and it can raise issues for the surrounding communities in dealing with the byproducts of these factory farms. But we keep doing it this way. Well, why is it we do it that way? Well, for the simple fact that that way of producing meat is the most profitable model that people have come up with, and it produces a lot of meat in a way that's very affordable for most people. And so the reason for continuing with that way of producing meat is basically economic. It makes a lot of money for certain meat producers, and it allows the consumers to eat a lot of meat for relatively low prices. But what happens if we look at it in ethical terms? Right? That's basically just a pragmatic approach. There's no real right and wrong argument going on. It's the simple question of, well, this is the way that makes the most money, or this is the way that allows me to afford the most meat. That's not necessarily, of course, an ethical position. That doesn't mean this is a good or a right way to do things. And to make that kind of a judgment, then we obviously have to incorporate some ethical analysis of the situation. And that analysis, those judgments are going to vary depending on the type of ethical system that we hold to. We'll get to the natural law Christian response to these issues in a minute, but I wanted to begin with looking at the utilitarian view of modern American meat production. Now, in a lot of cases, natural law or Christian ethics is critical of utilitarianism. It's going to say that it leads us to some wrong conclusions in terms of sexual ethics or medical ethics or what have you. But that's not to say that the systems are always going to disagree. And one of the ways that utilitarianism has really done an important job in bringing ethical issues to people's consciousness is in terms of these issues of looking at the treatment of animals. Personally, I disagree with Peter Singer on just about everything else he says, but I think he does have some good points to raise about the way our society treats animals, and in particular animals being raised for meat. So you don't need to necessarily be a Christian to raise critical questions about these factory farming methods when applied to animals. And Singer raises a lot of questions, and he's famous for writing on this topic and for advocating vegetarianism, amongst other things. And now looking specifically at these factory farms, he really can't see any way in which they are moral. Right? So for a utilitarian, what ultimately determines if things are right or wrong is the balance of pleasure and pain. And when he looks at these systems, for him, there's no such thing as the intrinsic dignity of the human person. There's no such thing as this particular value with a human person or human life. For him, all that matters is pleasure or pain, right? Regardless of who or what is experiencing it. So when he looks at these factory farms with these animals kept in unnatural conditions at best and really crowded, difficult, even painful, stressful conditions, for him, he's going to see that as thousands and thousands and millions, even billions of beings that are subjected subjected to varying degrees of discomfort and pain, he would argue, for their entire lives. And so that's a lot of pain being brought into the system, if you will. Now, what's the advantage? Well, the advantage is larger quantities of affordable meat. But for him, that's going to be a relatively small benefit, right? So having meat multiple times a week instead of once or twice might give people some modest increase in pleasure, but it's not that much. And it's certainly nothing compared to the large amounts of suffering that he sees these animals experiencing in these systems. And so for him, factory farming is ultimately going to be completely unacceptable from a moral perspective. He will argue that the reason people justify this sort of behavior is that they are practicing speciesism. That is, they discount the suffering of animals because they reject the moral value, the moral meaning of any other creatures besides human beings. And of course, he's going to argue that this comes from Christian backgrounds, and it's this Christian legacy of focusing on the human person that allows us to do things like factory farming. Now, here, of course, is a place where the Christian perspective or the Catholic perspective would diverge from Singer's utilitarianism. We would agree that there is a moral value to animals, that we can't just treat them as inanimate objects or as machines. So there is a real value, and we would agree that it's wrong to discount the suffering of animals as a moral thing worthy of consideration. At the same time, we would say it is legitimate to differentiate between human beings and other creatures. And it may be permissible to do things to other creatures that we can't do to human beings. That doesn't mean, though, that we can do whatever we want to other creatures. Right? So that's something we've discussed before, and that's where the disagreement with Singer would be. But there would be agreement that we do need to consider animals and the way they're treated, and that is morally significant, even if it's not as significant as the way we treat human beings. Now, to go on a slightly broader scale beyond Peter Singer necessarily, and the focus on these factory farms, could a utilitarian allow for meat eating at all? And in one of his books, Peter Singer at least considers this possibility to say that there might be the possibility of what he would call conscientious omnivores, that is, people who conscientiously will eat some meat. But the only way that this would make sense in a kind of utilitarian scheme is that you would need to have animals who don't suffer their entire lives and who can, in fact, lead good, enjoyable lives. So these animals would need to be kept in a way that will allow them to do what it is that they naturally do, that they would be able to enjoy pleasure to the extent that different animals are able to in going about their animal lives and fulfilling their instincts. If you could then have these relatively pleasant lives, which were ended very quickly and humanely without much suffering, then when you factored in the modest suffering they might do at the end of their life, and compare that to the benefit to people who get to eat the meat, there might be a way to get the equation to work, if you will, from a utilitarian perspective, so that it could be possible for there to be moral meat. But this would require animals to be raised in very different environments from these factory farms, and it would really require a way of killing and then processing animals that was very quick and humane and as painless as possible. And so while that does happen in some cases, it certainly isn't part of the standard agricultural model in 21st century America. So looking at these factory farms from an ethical perspective, even from a utilitarian perspective, the judgment is going to be very negative. There might be the possibility of some meat consumption being justified. Singer himself disagrees with that and argues that killing animals is still wrong because even if it's quick and humane, the suffering of the animals is greater than the benefit to people. But he acknowledges that it could be open for debate, and that people might legitimately disagree with him and say that there could be animals that lead pleasant lives and then have a quick humane death that could be morally eaten. But Singer and the utilitarian argument is definitely going to argue that the current model is not ethically acceptable. So that's a quick summary of the utilitarian view. I want to turn now to look at the Christian view, particularly as it's presented by Wurzba in the chapter for this module. Utilitarianism, then, is certainly going to reject factory farming of animals, and depending on how you work out the utilitarian equations, it may or may not accept the possibility of any killing of animals for meat. Now, as we mentioned before, it's going to make those arguments basically based on the idea that animal suffering and or pleasure is more or less morally equivalent to human suffering and pleasure, and that the suffering of animals in the production of meat far outweighs then the modest increase in pleasure that human beings get from eating the animals. Now, obviously, Christianity is not going to, at least in general, accept those basic ideas. In the Christian system, there is a very distinct difference between human life and all other life on the planet. That it's only human life that has that intrinsic value that natural law is ultimately rooted in. So does this mean then that Christianity is going to reach different conclusions about the morality of factory farming of animals or of eating animals in general? And interestingly enough, I think this is one of those cases where there are different principles being used, but we're going to still end up at more or less the same sort of conclusion, just for different reasons. And so when we look at, well, what's the Christian attitude towards eating meat? Obviously, there's a whole host of different views on the issue of eating meat that can be called Christian. We can't go through all of those at the moment. There have certainly been many Christians throughout history who have argued for vegetarianism based on Christian principles. And you can see, in the Garden of Eden, prior to sin, there's no eating of animals. And it's only in the Bible, after the account of the flood, that you get God telling people that they can eat animals with certain restrictions. So some Christians would argue that eating of animals is part of sinful humanity and really shouldn't be part of a Christian humanity that's aiming to be what God intended human beings to be. Other Christians obviously have disagreed, and most Christians throughout all of history have not been vegetarian, although, of course, Christians in previous ages ate much less meat than we did because it was produced very differently. So we can't really give a comprehensive account of the Christian view of eating meat. So I thought for our purposes for this module, we would look at what I think is a particularly interesting approach to the issue that we can find in Wurzba's book, where he looks at this issue of the eating of animals and, as he puts the chapter title, Life Coming Through Death. And he's going to draw on a lot of the themes that he developed in the introduction, but here he's going to focus specifically on this issue of how do we think about eating animals theologically. And this is going to be a little different than the natural law approach, but I think they're compatible. Right? The natural law view, if you'll recall, is that God created this world, that all of the creatures in it are good, that he gave them the natures that they have for a reason, and that we ought to care for that nature, care for those creatures as much as possible. We as Christians, we as human beings, are called to be stewards. That is to continue God's creative work by caring for this world and following basically the nature that God set things up to have. So that we ought not to radically change nature. We shouldn't just force it to do whatever we want, but that we should respect the way the world was created, basically work with it to make it fruitful, to make it a good place for both ourselves and for other creatures. And so that's kind of the natural law stewardship approach to the issue, which would say we need to respect the natures of animals and to basically, I think, argue that the factory farming approach, which really reduces creatures just to a kind of meat-growing mechanism, isn't really respecting the nature, and that we do need to change it in ways to make it more in keeping with the way God designed the creatures to be. But Wurzbach takes a different approach. It focuses on it in terms of a Christian theology, a Christian spirituality. And again, he's really going to focus on this idea of communion and relationships, and this idea that we as human beings are supposed to be like God, who is all about these self-sacrificial relationships, that we ought to do that in our own lives and enter into those relationships with other people and with other creatures. And given this view of the way we relate to one another, this self-sacrifice, this circle of life coming out of death that he talked about in the introductory chapter as well, for him, he's not going to see physical death as kind of this ultimate evil, this ultimate problem. He really sees this cycle of life and death of one organism living off of the death of another, not necessarily as a bad thing or as an evil thing. That's simply the way God designed the world to work. And that is basically one of the key ways that creatures are in these communal relationships, is that some creatures die so that other creatures can live. And that's natural and good. Where the problem comes in, particularly when we get to people, is when we experience a spiritual death along with the physical death. Well, what does a spiritual death mean? Well, he talks about how it is a loss of relationships, a breaking of relationships, and a loss of meaning. And so when you have this disruption of the cycle, where you have a break in people's relationships and a real fear and apprehensiveness of those breaks that goes along with them, that's really where the badness of death comes in, to put it a little awkwardly. Right, and that comes out of sin. He would argue that originally this cycle of life and death would have been seen as just, this is the way it works, and we would have seen physical death as just a transition into another resurrected spiritual life. But that with sin coming into the picture, now we're afraid of death, and when we die, or when we worry about loved ones dying, we don't have this assurance that we are going to continue that relationship after death. We see it as a break, we see it as a loss, and it is a real break and loss, maybe in ways that it wouldn't have been if human beings had never sinned. But it's really that separation of relationships that's the real problem. And he would argue the same thing is true when we look at the death of animals, I think, right? That if we are really in a relationship with the physical world, with the plants and animals, where there's a mutual relating going on there, where we have a respect for the creatures that die in order that we could live, that we care for them, and in return, ultimately, they are going to die, and we will live in part from their death. He sees that as the way God set up nature to work. When we change that system into like factory farming or these concentrated animal feeding operations, we've broken that relationship. There's no give and take anymore. The animals are just forced into these unnatural habitats, and there is no sacrifice on our part in caring for them in return for their sacrifice, ultimately providing food for us. And so this brings a break in the relationship. It brings a loss of meaning. There's no real meaning to a McNugget. There's no real meaning to a Big Mac in the way there is if you are living this stewardship model where you are caring for creation and then return benefiting from the food it provides. And he's going to say that this is not just, and a lot of people are going to hear this and say, oh, well, this is just all a bunch of liberal East Coast, hand-holding and tree-hugging. But he's going to argue that that's not really what's going on here, that this is really part of the Christian message. And he's going to argue that if we as Christians are called to be like God, and especially to be like Jesus, we need to think about things this way and we need to live this way, right? And so for Christians, the ultimate example, of course, is Jesus. And how does Jesus live his life? Well, Jesus ultimately sacrifices himself and offers himself to everyone else. And traditionally, Christians have seen this in the Eucharist in particular, right? That Catholics and other Christians have seen the Eucharist as either a symbolic representation if you're Protestant or if you're Catholic. It really is Christ being offered to you and for you in a bodily manner. And so Christ's self-sacrifice is made present in the Eucharist, and that we as Christians then share in it. And so you have this very concrete expression of the idea that death should be sacrificial, death should be something for the benefit of others, and it's really something that builds a relationship. Jesus isn't just a product that we receive in a sacrament in a church, that by receiving that Eucharist, by receiving that communion, you are entering into a relationship, right? And he would say, obviously, there's a distinct difference between receiving the Eucharist and eating chicken or eating beef, but there's not a complete and total separation either. Wurzba would argue that there should be analogously kind of relationship between us and the animals that we consume. That we should then turn around and sacrificially offer ourselves to other people and ourselves in care of the natural world. Now, again, this doesn't mean we literally die for other people, at least in most cases, but we should turn around and go out of our way to care for others, to sacrifice for others. And he talks about in the chapter the importance of sacrifice, especially in the Old Testament, in Judaism, and that it wasn't just, okay, we do this sacrifice to satisfy an angry God so he's not mad at us anymore, and we don't do the sacrifice as a way of channeling our aggression and negative feelings on this animal. Instead, it really is acting out this offering of something that's very important to us if we are an agricultural people, to offer our very best animals to God in sacrifice, and then that food of the sacrifice is shared with the other people in the community. That really is actually living out this attitude of giving what we have to other people and to other creatures in a broader sense. So for Wurzba, it's not death, it's not even the killing of animals that's a problem. It's when that happens in a way that's not part of this web of relationships, that's not part of a real communion. That's when it becomes problematic, and that's when he would argue you have a problem. And so I think ultimately his position ends up being very similar to the utilitarian one. He would say that the factory farming is not acceptable from a Christian perspective because it's not based in this relationship and not based in a communion. But that it would be possible to morally eat meat if you did have that give and take, if you did have a sacrifice on our part in caring for other people and caring for other creatures, that we in turn benefited from the sacrifice of those creatures for our food. And in the end of the chapter 2, he's going to talk about fasting and feasting. And this is distinctively kind of religious ways of eating, that sometimes we just choose not to eat for a certain length of time. We choose to not eat meat for a certain length of time in order to give ourselves time to reflect on what we eat, to give ourselves some discipline in deciding how we eat, really focusing on it. And we also will feast. But that doesn't just mean eating a whole bunch of food at once. Feasting in a spiritual sense is really rejoicing in the good things that we've received, rejoicing in the food that's made possible by the sacrifice of other creatures. So he's going to say there can be ethical meat eating, but it has to be part of this web of relationships that we have with other people and other creatures, which doesn't happen in the way most modern American meat is produced. Ultimately, then, what does all of this mean? We have this system that produces a lot of meat. It produces it very affordably and without any real effort on the part of the vast majority of Americans. And most people seem very content to go along with things the way they are. We like eating meat. It's affordable, and we don't really want to give that up. However, when we sit back and really think about, is this the right way for us to be doing things, from a variety of different ethical systems, it seems like there are real problems with this. There are problems in terms of the effects on the environment, the effects on workers and communities that produce the meat, effects on our health, and then also just the treatment of the animals. And really, if you look at even what the industry says, it recognizes that all of these things are problems that need to be addressed. But basically, the argument is, well, to change this, we would really have to change the way we do business, which would result in less meat and would result in higher prices. And basically, the idea is no one is willing to accept less meat or higher prices, so things will have to stay the way they are, at least until we come up with some technological way of dealing with some of these problems. Now, if we're going to look at this in terms of ethics, how should we really be living? Are we really living in a way that fits with what we ultimately say we believe? I think there are going to be real problems with that. And we can see this again from a utilitarian view or also from a Christian view. But then there are also other questions that come up. Is it really ethical to kill animals to eat them? Is there a real ethical difference between human beings and animals? Singer would say no. Christianity would say yes. And so that is going to make a difference in the position that we're ultimately going to take. And then if we say that it might be possible to morally eat animals, but they need to be treated humanely or in a way that keeps that works with the nature that they've been given by God, what does that look like? What does humane treatment of animals look like? What is a natural treatment of animals? So there are a whole bunch of different questions raised by this. And then, of course, I think really, at least from my perspective, if we think about it in terms of ethics, there definitely need to be changes in the system. So then the real questions are, what kind of changes would be necessary? And what responsibility do we as consumers have? Do I need to not eat any meat unless it's the meat that I know has been produced a certain way? Is that going to mean I spend much more money on meat and eat much less of it? Or can I simply advocate occasionally for changes in the system, but argue that, well, I'm just one person and I can't really change it, so I'm just going to buy the meat for the time being and hope it changes somewhere down the line. And so those are really, I think, the questions we are faced with. And so that's what I would like for you all to reflect on in the discussion boards as well, is to read the Worsbit chapter, read a selection or two on Blackboard, and then think about this and say, should we go to the grocery store and buy the cheap, mass-produced meat, or should we not? Or should we buy any meat at all, and what kind of meat could we buy? And these are the kinds of questions I really want us to be thinking about, not just in the class in general, but also as you go to work on your papers, is to pick a specific issue like this, a specific product, and raise these questions. Is it really right to eat this, given the concerns about how it's produced? Obviously, I think we can see that there are good ethical arguments for changing the way we produce meat. The question then is, what changes need to be made, and how are we supposed to morally act as consumers in the meantime before there are really those systematic changes in American food? So I will look for your thoughts on that in Blackboard, and as always, let me know if you have any questions.